Canada and the United States shared the longest undefended border on Earth. They shared supply chains, intelligence networks, a defense alliance, and 70 years of the most integrated economic relationship between any two nations in history. But on the morning Mark Carney stepped into office, something changed that cannot be changed back. $42 billion in new trade partnerships were announced in a single week. Canada did not beg for relief from American tariffs. Canada built the bypass. What you are watching is not a diplomatic spat. It is not a negotiation. It is a sovereign economic breakaway, executed quietly, precisely, and with devastating effectiveness. And the man in the Oval Office never saw it coming. Trump didn't just threaten a close ally. Trump didn't just impose tariffs on the country that supplies more energy to the United States than Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait combined. Trump radicalized a centrist economist into a geopolitical architect. He planned for immediate capitulation. He got systematic separation. And in the gap between that expectation and that reality, a coalition is forming that Washington did not authorize and cannot stop. Mark Carney is not reacting like a politician. He is not holding a press conference to express concern. He is not filing a complaint with the WTO. He is moving like a central banker in a crisis, methodical, mathematical, and building infrastructure that will still be running decades from now. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how we got here. I am going to walk you through the specific agreements Carney has already signed, the institutions he has activated, and the countries that are now watching Canada's playbook and replicating it. And I am going to tell you why the world you are living in today is measurably more dangerous for American economic dominance than the one you woke up in 6 months ago. Imagine you have a business partner. You have worked together for 70 years. Same supply chains, same defense contracts, same electricity grid. Then one morning, your partner unilaterally rips up the terms, calls your country a vassal state, and starts threatening to absorb you entirely. The question is not whether your partner acted irrationally. The question is, how long before you stop pretending this is a negotiation and start building a business that does not need them? Hold that thought, because that is exactly what Mark Carney just did. Before we go further, drop your answer in the comments right now. Did Trump walk into a trap of his own making by pushing Canada too far? Or is there still a strategy here that nobody outside Washington can see? Let us rewind the clock. This did not start with Mark Carney. It started in January of this year, when the White House imposed a 25% tariff on virtually all Canadian goods and, in what can only be described as a diplomatic miscalculation of historic proportions, publicly referred to Canada as a potential 51st state. Not once, repeatedly, with apparent seriousness. The previous Canadian government responded with measured concern and a request for dialogue. That response was interpreted in Washington as weakness. More pressure followed. The rhetoric escalated. And then the Liberal Party of Canada, trailing badly in the polls, widely expected to lose the next election, made a calculation that changed everything. They brought in Mark Carney. Carney's entire strategic response was built on dismantling one catastrophic assumption his opponent had made, that Canada would fold because Canada always had. Canada had always accommodated, because the economic logic had always supported accommodation. But Carney, who ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis without a single major Canadian bank failure, who then ran the Bank of England through the entire Brexit process without the British financial system collapsing, who has managed sovereign debt crises and currency pressures across 3 continents, who does not do rally speeches and has never sent a provocative tweet in his career. Carney looked at the numbers and reached a different conclusion. He didn't just see a tariff dispute. He saw a structural vulnerability that Canada had been building into its own foundation for 50 years. A country that had allowed over 90% of its exports to flow to a single customer. A country that, by its own design and its own comfort, had made itself dependent. He decided that dependence was the real enemy, not Trump. Trump was the accelerant. The problem was the kindling Canada had been stacking for decades. Receipt number 1. The European Union Partnership Acceleration Agreement. According to reporting confirmed by Reuters, the Financial Times, and Canada's own Department of Finance, within the first 30 days of Carney's government, Canada finalized a comprehensive trade acceleration framework with the European Union that had been languishing in ratification for years. The The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, had been signed in 2016 but never fully implemented. Political friction on both sides had kept it in a kind of diplomatic purgatory for nearly a decade. Carney's government moved immediately. They accelerated implementation, removed the outstanding barriers, and fast-tracked 32 specific sectors including energy, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and financial services. Now stop right there. CETA covers 548 million people, 548 million consumers who can now access Canadian goods at reduced or zero tariffs, legally, permanently, and without any involvement from Washington. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is Canada opening a second door while the first door is being kicked in. European energy buyers, who have been desperately seeking reliable alternatives to Russian supplies since 2022, are now looking at Canadian liquefied natural gas with the kind of urgency that changes infrastructure investment decisions. New LNG terminal proposals on Canada's east coast that sat unfunded for years are now receiving European sovereign investment interest. The volume of Canadian exports to Europe grew 18% in the first quarter alone. The pipeline is not metaphorical. It is being built, and it does not require American permission to stay open. Receipt number 2. The supply chain restructuring numbers. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. When the White House announced the Canada tariffs, the official messaging was that Canada would come to the table within weeks. The word used was capitulate. That word was used publicly, on record, by senior administration officials, not in a leaked memo, on television. Meanwhile, Canadian manufacturers were already restructuring. Auto parts suppliers in Ontario began qualifying European certification standards. Alberta energy companies began the permitting process for Pacific Coast export terminals. Quebec's aerospace sector, which supplies components to Boeing, began parallel certification with Airbus. The administration told you Canada had no options. Then we learned Canada had been building those options quietly for months. That is not miscommunication. That is a fundamental misread of who they were dealing with. The supply chain restructuring that was supposed to take years is happening in quarters, and it is not reversing. If this story is connecting dots that you have not seen assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people watching this unfold. There is still more coming. The security architecture piece, the specific numbers on what this means for your mortgage, your job, and your retirement account. Hit subscribe right now. This channel is tracking this story in real time, and you need to be here when the next piece drops. We are moving fast, and this is accelerating faster than any single outlet can keep pace with. Now compare what Carney is quietly building to what Washington is actually saying. The president told a press conference, and this is a direct quote, "Canada needs us far more than we need Canada. They'll come back. They always come back." That statement was made while Canadian trade delegations were simultaneously in Brussels, Tokyo, and Mexico City. And his analysis is that they will come back because they always have. A senior trade advisor was asked directly, what happens if Canada successfully diversifies 30% of its export base away from the United States? His response was, that's not possible in the current timeline. Canada's own trade ministry numbers show they are already at 11% diversification in 9 months. These are not serious people managing a serious strategic realignment. These are performers staging confidence while the architecture being built around them becomes permanent. Here is the part that should keep Washington awake at night. Canada is not doing this alone. That is receipt number 3, the coalition effect. Japan signed a critical minerals partnership with Canada in February. Not a letter of intent, a binding 10-year framework covering lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the materials that every electric vehicle, every advanced weapon system, and every semiconductor requires. Japan is the world's 3rd largest economy, and it just decided that Canadian supply chains are more reliable than American ones for the materials that define the next century of industrial production. Think about what that sentence means. The United Kingdom, still navigating its post-Brexit identity and looking for tangible evidence that sovereignty outside the EU is workable, announced a bilateral trade framework with Canada that explicitly bypasses the existing Five Eyes trade norms, and London did it publicly, without apology, because the domestic politics now favor distance from Washington. India, which has been watching the treatment of a democratic, English-speaking, rule-of-law nation with undisguised alarm, opened formal free trade negotiations with Canada for the first time in a decade. India has 1.4 billion people and is the world's fastest-growing major economy. If those negotiations reach even a partial conclusion, the scale of Canada's new trading relationships becomes genuinely transformative. And Australia, which sits in its own complicated strategic pressure relationship with great powers, quietly signed a defense industrial cooperation agreement with Ottawa that includes joint rare earth processing and technology transfer. These are not symbolic gestures of solidarity. These are load-bearing partnerships. They are being built because every one of those governments watched what happened to Canada and asked the same question. Are we next? The answer, for most of them, was yes. So they are building the same bypass. Canada's moves did not contain the problem. They inspired replication, exactly as Carney intended. Now let us look at what this actually means when you strip away the diplomatic language and examine the structural contrast. Trump demands loyalty. Carney offers value. Trump wants compliance. Carney wants partners. Trump tears up agreements. Carney builds systems. Trump governs by rally. Carney governs by mathematics. Trump builds the grievance. Carney builds the bypass. One is noise. The other is architecture. There is one image from this past month that captures this entire story. On one side, a rally in a swing state. 15,000 people cheering the news that Canada had been slapped with tariffs. A podium, a crowd, a flag, and a man promising that America had won. On the other side, Mark Carney in a Brussels conference room. No crowd, no flags, no cameras. Signing a document that redirected $18 billion in annual trade flow. One side performed the victory, the other side built the reality. Carney did not have to match the energy of a rally to be heard. He just had to show up with better math. So what does this actually mean for you? Not for diplomats, not for analysts, for the person watching this. If you work in the auto industry, in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, or any state where auto manufacturing is the economic spine of your community, here is the specific mechanism. A car assembled in a North American plant crosses the Canadian border an average of 7 times during production. Engine blocks from Ontario, transmissions from Ohio, electronics from Quebec, seating components crossing back and forth, final assembly in Michigan. That only works if the border is frictionless. Every tariff, every retaliatory measure, every threatened reclassification adds friction, and friction costs money. Real, measurable, per-unit money that shows up in procurement reviews. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis have already begun internal feasibility studies on restructuring production to qualify for the new Canadian trade routes to Europe. They have not announced it publicly, but those studies do not get commissioned unless the math is already pointing somewhere uncomfortable. If even one major assembly plant restructures its footprint, the supplier network in your county restructures with it. The parts suppliers, the tool and die shops, the trucking companies, the diners that feed the second shift workers. Those jobs do not come back on a tweet. If you hold a 401k or any retirement account with significant North American equity exposure, the VIX, the Market Volatility Index, spiked 14% the week the Canada-EU Acceleration Agreement was announced. Not because markets were scared of Canada, because markets immediately understood what it meant for American corporate supply chains that were priced at decades-old tariff-free assumptions. The companies that built their profit margins on Canadian raw materials, Canadian energy, Canadian intermediate components, are now repricing their entire cost structures. That cost gets passed somewhere. It gets passed to earnings. Earnings determine your retirement account's value. That is not a projection. That is already showing up in quarterly earnings revisions across the industrial sector. Your account is absorbing this in real time. If you are a farmer in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, or any Midwest state that exports agricultural products, Canada was your third largest buyer for corn, soybeans, beef, and pork. Canada has retaliated with targeted agricultural tariffs, and more critically, Canada is now redirecting its enormous purchasing power toward European and South American suppliers. The soybean market has already felt it. Corn futures responded the week the retaliatory measures hit. Your elevator prices are not operating in a vacuum. They are operating inside a geopolitical decision that was made in Washington without anyone asking the farming community whether they could absorb the consequences. The administration calls it temporary. The new long-term supply contracts Canada is signing with Brazil are not temporary. Supply relationships that form during a disruption harden into contracts. Contracts do not get renegotiated because of a photo opportunity at a summit. If you work in the energy sector, in Alberta-adjacent American states, in pipeline construction, in refinery processing, Canada supplies the United States with more crude oil per day than Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait combined. That is not a figure that can be dismissed. Any sustained deterioration in the Canada-US energy relationship does not raise gas prices a few cents. It restructures the entire North American energy cost basis. And Canada is already building the export infrastructure to move that oil west to Asian markets instead of south to American refineries. Once those terminals are operational, the leverage equation flips permanently. Canada stops needing American refineries. American refineries start needing to find Canadian oil that is no longer guaranteed. If you own a home with a variable rate mortgage or are looking to refinance, consider this. TD Bank and Royal Bank of Canada collectively hold or service mortgage-backed securities affecting millions of American homeowners. Not Canadian homeowners, American ones. Any significant financial disruption in the Canada-US banking relationship does not stay north of the border. It moves through the integrated financial system both countries built over 70 years. The administration says the relationship is fine. The financial institutions managing your mortgage are quietly running stress tests for a scenario where it is not. The administration responsible for all of this is on television saying the tariffs are working, that Canada is at the table, that America is winning. The new Pacific export terminal permits in British Columbia are not at the table. The Japan Critical Minerals Framework is not at the table. The EU trade acceleration generating 18% export growth is not at the table. Those things are at a different table entirely, one that Washington was not invited to and may not even know is meeting. Here is the hard truth. Mark Carney did not want this. Canada did not want this. No country with 90% of its exports flowing to one customer wants to rebuild its entire trade architecture from scratch. That is an enormously expensive, enormously risky undertaking that takes years to mature and creates enormous disruption in the short term. But the sustained pressure, the tariffs, the rhetoric about annexation, the public humiliation of a democratic partner, it left no choice. Carney is not emotional about it. He is not doing this out of pride or outrage or revenge. He is doing it because the structural data demands it, and because the window to do it, while Canada still has the financial reserves, the diplomatic relationships, and the global credibility to pull it off, is open right now, and will not stay open forever. The moral verdict is this. This rupture was not an accident of negotiation. It was the predictable outcome of treating a partner like a vassal. Where does this go from here? I see three paths. The first is what I would call the managed path. Both governments find a formula, some combination of tariff reduction, side agreements, and face-saving language that allows both leaders to declare partial victory. Trade flows partially normalize. Some of the damage is contained. But even in this best case, the European trade acceleration does not reverse. It is already generating revenue. The Japan Critical Minerals Framework does not get dismantled because Canada and the United States reached a new bilateral deal. It is already operational. The Canadian companies that began qualifying for European and Asian markets do not re-narrow their customer base out of loyalty. They keep the new customers. They just also keep the American ones. The dependence is gone. Permanently. Even in the best case, the Canada that existed on January 1st of this year, 90% reliant on a single trading partner, fully integrated, strategically vulnerable, that Canada is over. It doesn't get rebuilt. The architecture has already moved. The second path is the domino. This is the scenario that nobody in the mainstream press is naming clearly enough. Canada's successful pivot becomes the publicly documented playbook that every middle power on Earth has been waiting for. South Korea is watching. Mexico is watching. Australia is already following. The template is now proven. When a large democratic nation with significant natural resources systematically diversifies away from American market dependence and survives, not just survives, but grows. Every other nation facing similar pressure does the same calculation. And once the new trade architecture forms, once the new port facilities are built, and the new certification standards are met, and the new long-term supply contracts are signed, they do not restructure back. The United States does not lose these relationships in a dramatic confrontation. It loses them quietly, country by country, sector by sector, as the opportunity cost of American partnership rises past the point where the math supports it. The third path is the fracture. This is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Escalation does not de-escalate. The retaliatory cycle deepens. Canada, now emboldened by new partnerships and facing domestic political pressure to hold firm, matches every American move with a targeted response. Energy becomes a weapon, and Canada supplies the United States with more oil than any other country on Earth. The integrated electrical grid that powers the American Northeast becomes a diplomatic variable. You would normally say no leader, no prime minister, no president would allow a fundamental rupture in North American security infrastructure over a trade dispute. But normal left the building a long time ago, and there are no more guardrails. None. What replaced them is performance. And performance, unlike guardrails, has no floor. Here is what I know for certain, regardless of which path this takes. The world where Canada's economic survival depended entirely on American goodwill is finished. Even if every tariff was removed tomorrow, even if a comprehensive new bilateral agreement was signed next week, the structural lesson has been learned and acted upon. Carney has proven that diversification is possible, that the partnerships are available, and that the cost of vulnerability is higher than the cost of restructuring. Once that lesson is absorbed by a nation of 40 million people, with the world's second-largest landmass, the second-largest proven oil reserves, and the largest freshwater system on Earth, it does not get unlearned because someone signs a communiqué. It becomes the new operating premise. Canada did not start this fight. Canada did not want this fight. But Canada is proving to be extraordinarily capable at it. Not because Canada is aggressive, because Canada is patient, precise, and operating on a time horizon that the administration across the border demonstrably cannot comprehend. Trump is looking at the next rally, the next poll number, the next news cycle. Carney is looking at the next decade. Right now, the next decade is being built in Brussels, in Tokyo, in New Delhi, in Canberra, and in Ottawa. It is not being built in Washington. Did Mark Carney cause this realignment? Or did Washington do that entirely by itself, and Carney is simply the man who was in position when the moment arrived? And when the shuttered factories come, when the auto plants that depended on frictionless borders post their closure notices, when the farm families in Iowa open their price reports and realize the Canadian buyer is gone, will the people who cheered for this, who called it strength, who said it was about time someone stood up, will they still say it was worth it? And if this coalition continues to grow, if Japan, India, the EU, the UK, and Australia formalize what is now a loose alignment into something with actual institutional architecture, what does American economic leadership look like from inside that new world? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, because the next chapter of this story involves moves that have not been announced yet, and you need to be here when they land. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.